Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee of Appropriations. Thank you all for your patience. We just had full committee voting, so we're a little late getting here. We have 4 agencies to go through today: State Lottery and Gaming Control Agency, Department of Natural Resources, Maryland Department of Transportation Debt Service, and the Maryland Transportation Authority. We will start with the State Lottery and Gaming Control Agency. Mr. Martin, feel free to come to the table while we hear the analysis from Ryan Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we can see on page 1, the fiscal 2024 budget increases for the State Lottery and Gaming Control Agency by $1.6 million, or 1.3%, to $121 million. Moving on to the top of page 2, the fiscal 2024 budget includes one proposed deficiency for the Maryland Lottery and Gaming Control Agency to replace $264,000 in special funds with the same amount of general funds for personal expenses to align funding for VLT operations to current estimates. Additionally, on page 2, we can look at Exhibit 1 for an overview of agency spending by program. Here we can see that the vast majority, 80%, is for administration and operations, with 17% for video lottery terminals, and then 4% for sports wagering. Moving on to Exhibit 2 on page 3 for an overview of agency spending by use. We can again see that the majority of spending is for contractual services at 66%. Personnel spending makes up 31%, and then all other expenses make up the remaining 3%. Additionally, the Maryland Lottery and Gaming Control Agency has $1.2 million in contracts for televised drawings of lottery games. In December 2022, the MLGCA announced that it was no longer televising drawings. The Department of Legislative Services therefore recommends deleting the funds dedicated to this purpose. Moving on to Exhibit 3 on page 4 for a proposed budget explanation, we can again see that the budget increases by about $1.6 million, and this is largely driven by a $2.1 million increase for the State Lottery Central Control Monitoring System, which is driven by debit card equipment costs and transaction fees, as well as fees for lottery vendors. Looking at personnel on page 5, we can see that the MLGCA has 42 vacancies as of December 31st, 2022, more than double the number needed to meet the budgeted turnover expectancy. Of the 42 vacancies, 10 have been vacant for less than 3 months, and 3 have been vacant for more than a year. The Sports Wagering and Fantasy Gaming Program has 23 vacancies that have been open for between 7 and 9 months. The MLGCA expected some delays in the program's start and has purposely waited to fill some positions until there was a better understanding of how many licenses would be awarded. Additionally, there were delays in the recruiting process due to the classifications of the positions, and the MLGCA is currently in the process of filling 18 of them. Moving on to the key observations, starting on page 6, looking at Exhibit 4 for lottery earnings, we can see that lottery sales in fiscal 2022 increased by 2% compared to fiscal 2021. Moving on to Exhibit 5 on page 7 for casino earnings. Overall casino revenues, including both video lottery terminals and table games in the state, increased by $256 million, or 15%, compared to fiscal 2021. This is largely driven by a reduction in pandemic-related effects on casino use. Looking at Exhibit 6 on page 8 for VLT revenue disbursements, overall VLT revenues for fiscal 2022 exceeded $1.3 billion, 15% more than fiscal 2021, and 32% more than the preceding 5-year average. Overall revenue in fiscal 2023 is largely expected to be level compared to fiscal 2022. Moving on to Exhibit 7 on page 9 for table game revenue disbursements, we can again see that there was a 15% increase in fiscal 2021, and table game revenue was 5.5% above the pre-pandemic fiscal 2019, and is expected to remain above the pre-pandemic level in fiscal 2023, with a projected 9% increase compared to fiscal 2022. Looking at Exhibit 8 on page 10, for the breakdown of the 5 retail sports books operations within the state, we can see the breakdown and that millions of dollars are being contributed to the state from sports wagering. Additionally, on page 11, there is a discussion of mobile sports wagering, which is sports wagering through the internet on a computer or mobile device, which began in Maryland in late November 2022. There are currently 8 mobile sports wagering operators licensed within the state. An additional 6 have applied and have been approved by the SWORC and are expected to begin operations during fiscal 23. 7 other vendors have applied for licenses and have not yet been approved by SWORC and would begin, if approved, sometime in fiscal 2024. Exhibit 9 on page 11 shows the total handle, prizes paid, promotional play, other deductions, and taxable wins for November and December 2022. The low taxable win figure and final tax contributions relative to the handle are because free promotional play wagering money is deducted from taxable wins. Going forward, tax contributions should see significant increases as regulations require that after the first full fiscal year for each sportsbook, the sportsbook's promotional play amount may not exceed 20% of the taxable win from the prior fiscal year. Additionally, the amount of promotional play currently being provided is not considered sustainable by the MLGCA and should decline later in fiscal 2023. The Board of Revenue Estimates estimated in December 2022 that mobile sports wagering would provide $27.9 million in contributions to the state in fiscal 2023, largely driven by decreases in promotional play spending compared to current levels. Finally, page 12 has the exact wording for our recommended action to cut the funds for the televised lottery drawings. The remaining pages are appendices. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Any questions for the analyst? We'll now turn to the department. Director Martin, thanks for being here.
Thank you. For the record, John Martin, Director, Maryland Lottery and Gaming Control Agency. Good afternoon, Chairman Corman, Vice Chair Watson, and the members of the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. I welcome the opportunity to appear before you today to present the Maryland Lottery and Gaming Control Agency's fiscal 2024 budget. At this time, I'd like to thank the Department of Legislative Services, and particularly Ryan Green, for his excellent work and analysis of our budget. I would also like to thank Shane Benz and the Department of Budget and Management for their assistance in developing the agency's budget. With me today, to my left, Paula Yoakum, our Chief Financial Officer, Angela Jones, our Budget Specialist, James Butler, our Assistant Deputy Director and Chief of Staff, and Sean Ford, our Director of Legislation and Policy Development. I'd like to begin by giving you a brief update on our current businesses. Maryland Lottery and Gaming established many record-setting totals in fiscal 2022. The lottery, the state's 6 casinos, and sports wagering combined to contribute a little more than $1.5 billion to the state in FY22. These contributions support vital state programs and services such as public health, public safety, education, human resources, and the environment. While that's great news, the better news is that we are ahead of that pace as we entered the second half of fiscal 23. Our traditional lottery business is strong for both our scratch-off instant tickets as well as our draw game products. In calendar 2023, we are celebrating our 50th year of lottery sales with a number of new games and player promotions that should contribute significantly to our bottom line by responsibly growing sales and increasing our revenue contribution. Since our inception in 1973, we have awarded more than $31.5 billion in prizes to lottery players and generated more than $18.6 billion in lottery revenue to the state of Maryland. Lottery retailers, many of them small business owners and first-generation immigrants, have earned $2.9 billion in retailer commissions over that time. As you know, we also regulate the VLT and casino gaming market, as well as the emerging sports wagering and fantasy gaming competition activities. We continue to see all 6 casino partners strive to exceed their fiscal 2022 revenue contribution and attendance counts amid strong regional competition. The overall sports wagering landscape continues to grow as we now have 10 retail and 8 mobile sports books in operation. By the end of this calendar year, we may have as many as 15 to 20 retail locations and 21 mobile licenses participating in sports wagering in Maryland. When fully operational in 2024, we anticipate generating $25 to $30 million annually in contributions to the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund. As it relates to the FY24 budget, we concur with the DLS recommended action. With that, I am happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Vice Chair Watson has the first question.
Thank you, Mr. Martin, for being with us today. And it sounds like you've made a lot of progress in growing the agency. I was wondering if you could maybe give us some update on the response of the agency to the audit recommendations, your last audit, which had 7 findings and 1 repeat finding.
Yes, be happy to. We, as you're well aware, responded to that in April of 2022, and then subsequently had a review with the Joint Audit and Evaluation Committee in November of 2022 to address that. Many of the findings, which go back several years, we have addressed even prior to the audit itself. Many of them were administrative in terms of new policies and procedures that we put in place with personnel, and just tying up some loose ends where it may have been a miscommunication either between our vendors and ourselves in terms of various elements of their contract. At this point, there really are no outstanding issues. Everything has been addressed, and unless there's a specific item that you wanted me to talk to, I'll be happy to do that.
I'm just going to give you one, and then I'll hand it off to my colleague, but how often are the VLTs tested?
The VLT testing, it's basically an ongoing basis. Many of the VLTs that are tested are done at the property, obviously, by the teams on site there, and they are monitored and reported back on a timely basis. That's really an ongoing process.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Delegate Metzger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. It's always a privilege and an honor to hear the lottery talk to us. In fact, one year I had a lottery town hall. It was very good, but I'm concerned about finding number 5. It says that they did not always follow the state procurement regulations and did not adequately monitor certain contracts. I'm concerned because we as the delegation, as the state legislators, have worked very hard to put certain state procurement programs into place. And it bothers me when I see that it did not adequately. So can you respond to that?
Sure, be happy to, Delegate. Behind finding 5, there were 3 or 4 specific administrative issues, and they've all been addressed to date. One had to do with not being on the eMaryland Marketplace. I think there was an opportunity there where the eMaryland Marketplace was actually down for a period of time. And so when it came back up, I think we may have missed an opportunity to be in there in a timely manner. That has been addressed a couple of years ago. Another was reimbursements with some of our vendors for elements in their contract. They had to do with specifically visiting the plant locations for the auditing of their print production process for our scratch-off business. That reimbursement was addressed, successfully completed in early 2022. One other issue in finding 5 had to do with escrow accounts for software for our central systems on our VLT business, our lottery business, and our ITLM business. That had to be initiated with 3 separate vendors. I think one of the vendors, we were lax in getting the correct information. The other 2 vendors missed the information on their side. So we've addressed all of 3 of those. So those are all in place. The last one, I believe, the part of finding 5 had to do with information exchange with Scientific Games, our central systems vendor, and managing the criminal background checks and personal information of various employees of Scientific Games, which is part of our normal process. And that has been updated now on a quarterly basis where we get updated information from Scientific Games.
So you're following through with that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think all of the findings of elements of findings 5 have been addressed. Okay.
And as I was reading, the more I kind of was reading was finding number 7, the remote access to the MLGCA. Network by employees, authorized contractors use a single authentication measure rather than more secure. Can you explain that one?
I believe that's just a function of timing. Right now we have a multi-factor authentication process. We work very closely with DoIT and follow their guidelines. So I think it may have been when this was in place, we did not have the multi-factor authentication that we do now.
Can you explain a little bit on the multi-factor?
Sure. Quite simply, the process is such that on most instances or software applications, you initially put in your username and password.
Right.
And what the multi-factor puts another level where now they send a text to your phone with a code that you have to put in to further. That's the second factor to authenticate that you are the individual accessing the account. So it's a security, and it's now in place for, I think, everything that we do now.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Metzger. Do you happen to recall your FY23 current budget year advertising budget?
I'm sorry, did you have a question on that?
Do you happen to recall what it is? I don't know what it is. I don't have it in front of me.
Oh, the current
FY23
budget? Yeah,
advertising
let's see
budget.
if Ms. Yoakum can find that.
Approximately, if you don't know.
I would say it's very close to where it is in the document here, so it's probably in the $18 million range.
Okay. And that's about what you're proposing for FY24? Is that what you're just saying?
Yes, I unless Ryan, if you remember differently, I think it's fairly flat in terms of fiscal 23 to 24.
Okay, great. Thank you. I can, of course, follow up with Ryan as well. Appreciate it. Any further questions for this agency? Okay, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we will now turn to the Department of Natural Resources. The analysis from Andrew Gray and Secretary Kurtz and your team. Feel free to come to the table while we're hearing from Mr. Gray. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 1, Department of Natural Resources Fiscal 2024 Budget Analysis, the operating budget summary reflects an increase of $49.2 million, or 13.7%, to $408.2 million. Getting right into the Managing for Results exhibits. Exhibit 1 reflects the Maryland State Park visitors and capacity closures. What you're seeing here is that spike in both visitors and capacity closures. So capacity closures have been kind of increasing over time, then really are exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Everybody was outside recreating safely, which was great, but it caused some severe stress on the parks. However, we're now seeing a decrease in both the number of closures and also the visitors using parks. The number reflected for fiscal 22 is about 19.4 million visitors. However, it looks like, based on some more recent data, that could be even lower looking forward. So interesting to see how that pans out in terms of what our visitation looks like. Exhibit 2 reflects some concerns about the crabs. The winter dredge survey is the primary method for determining how the crabs are doing in the Chesapeake Bay, the blue crab. And basically, there's a lot of spaghetti on this chart here, but I'll try to simplify it. The basic idea is that the crab population is going down. See the blue columns on the far right is going down almost to 200 million crabs. This is worrisome because we've been doing a lot of management on the female crabs, so we're actually seeing an increasing linear trend in terms of the females bigger than 2.4 inches. That's the little red dotted line going forward, kind of the orange line showing the actual density. But we're seeing an overall decline in the population, and it looks like this could be correlated with the males. The male population has been declining over time and is at its lowest level in calendar 22. Therefore, the administration did institute some measures, in particular modification to the recreational male hard crab catch and possession limits that was instituted on February 22nd, 2023 to address that concerns about over-harvesting. Third exhibit on page 11 reflects the Natural Resources Police. What would it take to actually get the Natural Resources Police to have that full minority reflection and employment by calendar 2027, or fiscal 2027, excuse me. And this chart sort of attempts to break down what that would look like, kind of year by year, in terms of the shift of the racial makeup of the Natural Resources Police. And it shows there would be an incredibly big challenge in order to kind of shift to a larger white female, black or African American male force, and also black or African American female force as well. So interesting to see how the administration is able to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that as an issue in this analysis. On page 12, we'll talk a little bit about the legislative priorities. There was $1.1 million or so in the Revenue Stabilization Account for fiscal 2023. This is the rainy day fund for a grant to the Chesapeake Bay Trust for the Chesapeake Conservation Corps. That funding has now been released, therefore is reflected in the budget. It's sort of a down payment of the $1.5 million. It's now reflected in the Chesapeake Bay Trust, the Board of Public Works budget for the Chesapeake Bay Trust. The deficiencies for fiscal 23, there are 3 noted there, an increase around $2.2 million for federally funded environmental restoration projects in the Chesapeake Coastal Service. There's also funding from the Port Security and Boating Safety federal grant programs and the Natural Resources Police as well. In terms of the federal stimulus funds, there is funding that DNR is both attempting to receive, has received, is not budgeted, and then actually budgeted itself. DNR is looking at kind of funding from 3 major pots in terms of the Chesapeake Bay program funding allocation, funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture for forest-related work, and then also U.S. Department of Commerce's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for Coastal Zone Management and Estuarine Research. DLS recommends that DNR comment on potential funding opportunities available through the Inflation Reduction Act as well, and DNR's planned efforts to pursue competitive funding. Exhibit 4 reflects the overview of agency spending. Chesapeake and Coastal Service is the largest single entity there, 22% of the overall budget for DNR, $90.9 million, largely reflecting the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay 2010 Trust Fund, around $56 million, reflecting grant funding in fiscal 2024. Largely, the other portions of the administrations reflect contract and grant funding too, but mostly are salaries for those agencies to do their work. Exhibit 5 on page 16 reflects the proposed budget. Once again, that 13.7% increase, $49.2 million. In terms of the expenses, personnel expenses, there are new positions, 75 in the Maryland Park Service in particular, not the entire change of the position count, but that reflects overall about a $4.4 million increase in funding, employee and retiree health insurance around $3.5 million, and also the annualization of that November 22 COLA. In terms of the other components, the natural resources police, or the natural resources policy, around $14 million increase for the Chesapeake Atlantic Coastal Bay 2010 Trust Fund. That's around $11.5 million from largely general fund revenue that's being budgeted in prior years due to deficiencies, concerns about reductions in revenue that's now still able to be used. And then you're also seeing funding reflected in the $2.5 million general funds for tree planting work, part of the Tree Solutions Now Act. There's $4 million or so reflected for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation of America, the beautiful federal funding. However, do note that DNR did note in its commentary on this analysis that there are a couple of opportunities for funding that have not panned out. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funding is not necessarily going to be reflected in the actual budget due to, changes in the opportunities for that funding. However, there are some other opportunities that we're seeing increased funding that would be reflected. Potentially, it's no change in the overall federal fund appropriation. It'll just be a change in the mix in terms of what they're receiving. That would be the most effective basins funding increasing. Then we'll move down to the contract for a new outdoor recreation apprenticeship programs. There are $2 million reflected in the budget, but that's only $1 million in general funds going into a special fund, and then $1 million being spent out of that special fund. So only $1 million in new funding. Then there's $950,000 for the Mel Nolan Fellowship funding mandate, which was increased by Chapter 223 of 2021. In terms of the contract funding on page 17, around $2 million for America, the Beautiful Challenge funding. This is Chesapeake and Coastal Service funding. And then routine operations really is around $12.5 million for vessels and vehicle purchases, including the research vessel Curran replacement. Moving now to page 21 is the personnel data. You see an 82 position count increase between the 2 years. This largely reflects, once again, the funding for the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. You're seeing 75 regular positions in the Maryland Park Service and 2 assistant attorneys general in the Office of the Secretary. To satisfy the mandated 90 positions, there were 15 positions were already provided in the fiscal 23 budget. And you see a small increase in the contractual FTEs for the agency. Still has a healthy, unfortunately, a healthy vacancy count, and certainly a number of vacancies above turnover. First issue concerns the Tree Solutions Now Act, how that funding is now being was planned for, at least, and the recommendations have been identified for that. So forest policy is obviously very important for the natural kind of landscape in Maryland. Forests are sort of our kind of our green infrastructure, if you will. The Chapter 645, the Tree Solutions Now Act, set the goal of planting 5 million sustainable trees in Maryland by the calendar 2031, at least 500,000 underserved urban communities. In addition, there's a recent report that was completed by the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology, published the forest technical study that kind of reflected some of the trends that we're seeing. That we're seeing less loss of forest, but we're seeing a sort of shift in the type of forest in the state. We're seeing less kind of natural cover, more sort of trees, but sort of more in the urbanized areas and kind of other intermediate areas, not necessarily the kind of urban, like rural, kind of original forest cover. DLS recommends that DNR comment on its role in realizing the recommendations outlined by the Commission for the Innovation and Advancement of Carbon Markets and Sustainable Tree Plantings, mentioned in paragraph 2. And then the implication of the forest technical study for the work of the Forest Service, particularly as it relates to the need for a landscape approach to forest conservation. Issue Number 2 concerns the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. We talked a little bit about the funding that's showing up in the budget. There's a number of things that are required of the agency, not only of Department of Natural Resources, also Department of Budget Management, Department of General Services, and also the Department of Legislative Services as well. In terms of the work the Department of Legislative Services is required to do is to hire an independent consultant. That has occurred. First kickoff meeting for that work will be in early March 2023. In terms of the work that's being done by DNR, certainly I talked about the funding, a little bit of this analysis. DLS recommends that DNR comment on the status of implementing the overall provisions of Chapter 39 under the following categories noted in the analysis. In addition, DLS recommends that DNR comment on the status of the outdoor recreation and the Office of Outdoor Recreation and the plans for the Outdoor Recreation Apprenticeship Program. Third and final issue in this analysis on page 24 concerns the Natural Resources Police hiring and promotion plan. So fiscal 23 budget bill language restricts to $750,000 in general funds until the submission of a plan. The basic idea being how to get the Natural Resources Police to, by fiscal 2027, to represent Maryland in terms of that 20 to 41-year-old category, in terms of our census, in terms of our demographics. We talked a little bit about this in managing for results in terms of what that's going to look like, the big lift in terms of the shift, the mix, the Natural Resources Police's force. The submitted reports do reflect some interesting kind of underlying challenges that are reflected not just for this current for Natural Resources Police here in Maryland, but also for police forces and conservation police forces across the nation. A couple of things noted here: that minorities are underrepresented in the traditional outdoor activities that inspire working for conservation police agencies. You're not seeing as many people necessarily exposed to the type of things that would lead to an interest in a career in natural resources police law. Minorities applying but not necessarily appearing for testing, which obviously makes it very difficult to then try to hire them. And then finally, minority applicants who do test are not selected due to low math and physical test scores. So obviously, opportunities there for some mentoring perhaps. DLS recommends that DNR comment on the status of reaching the first 20% increment for increasing the representation of minorities within NRP and the progress made both with its recent and upcoming recruitments and existing staff development. Recommended actions start on page 25. There are 2 of them. First one there is to restrict $100,000 until the submission of the Chesapeake Atlantic Coastal Bay 2010 Trust Fund annual work and expenditure plans discussed as part of the Chesapeake Bay overview. And recommendation 2 on page 25 is also discussed in the Chesapeake Bay overview. It's the summary of Chesapeake Bay restoration spending narrative. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you. Andrew, any questions for the analyst? Okay, seeing none. Secretary Kurtz, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair Corman, Vice Chair Watson, members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for having me today to talk about the operating budget for the Department of Natural Resources. For the record, my name is Josh Kurtz, I'm the acting secretary. I want to thank Mr. Gray for the thorough and deep analysis of our budget. I think he raised some really important points that we're looking forward to discussing today. A couple of them are going to be covered in the questions that were asked. I think one of the things that really, we didn't have as many questions about DLS, but I wanted to talk about briefly is the crab survey. So when we look at this, crabs are an incredibly important species for us economically, also culturally. When we look at what's going on with our crab populations, we have a few emerging threats that we're working to tackle, especially invasive species. When you look at the blue catfish and the flathead catfish. We're also really excited because this year we've gotten additional funding to do a really deep dive analysis, a survey of crabs at a much higher level, which will give us a better understanding of not only the numbers, but their distribution during the winter months. So we're looking forward to moving forward with that, getting a better handle on the science behind our crab populations and better able to manage the population. I wanted to touch on personnel as well. You look at our vacancy rate up around 11%. There's a couple of places within our department where I would say we're having the highest levels and the most of a struggle. Especially in engineering and construction, we're running almost 30% vacancy rate there, which is making it challenging for us to implement some of the Chapter 39 provisions that were being discussed. We're working on how to be more competitive in that space. We know that this is always going to be a challenge for us, especially in the very highly technical areas when you look at opportunities in the federal, the local governments, and in the private sector. But we're working on a few different ideas and opportunities, especially thinking about how we attract recently graduated engineers into our programming and people that care about the outdoors. 2 other areas where we have high levels of vacancy, which we're focusing on, is in our finance shop and within HR. Obviously, we need to have a full HR shop to be able to be more effectively recruiting and hiring across the agency. So 3 very specific areas of focus in reducing our vacancy rates. And And with that, I will turn to the DLS analysis, if that's all right, Mr. Chair. So looking at the first issue, and that being the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm excited to say that we just completed an application for almost $30 million for our Maryland Forest Service. The big chunk of that is for the urban and community forestry funding within the IRA. When you look at the opportunities and what we've learned because of the Tree Solutions Now Act and how we're better able to reach especially urban and disadvantaged communities with our tree program, we're kind of building on that and looking for funding from the federal government to increase that. Also goes to forest legacy easement projects, so protecting forest, which as we heard and we'll touch on in a few minutes, also very critical for the health of our forests moving forward and downstream then of the water and of the people. So moving on to the Tree Solutions Now Act implementation. As was described, what we learned in this technical study is that around 33% of our forests, 40% is the goal, are protected. But the thing that was, I think, the most interesting takeaway was the fragmentation of our forests across the state. So what we're seeing is far less big contiguous blocks of forest, which are really important for water quality, and more smaller forests with gaps in between them, which impacts our wildlife habitat and our function of healthy forests. It allows for more invasive species, makes it more difficult to manage forests. So when you look at how do we tackle that, well, it really comes down to a few things. We have some programs that allow us either to not just outright acquire, but to put easements on properties. So work with those landowners to make sure that they're managing those properties so that we're seeing a reduction in some of those fragmented areas. We also have programs like lawn to woodland programs, which actually go out, identify these fragmented spaces, and then plant trees to reconnect these forests. All of these are really important for not only our forest programs and not only for our clean water, but for our natural sequestration and our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act goals. So we also have priority funding areas as well, so kind of continuing to drive that protection of healthy forests while also tackling the fragmentation issue. I want to turn now to the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. A lot to discuss there. A lot of money, a lot of opportunity, and I think something as a department we're very excited about moving forward. You've seen our budget increase because of this by about 42% over FY22 dollars. And we're looking at $30 million to spend on park acquisition. So I want to start there. And when we look at that acquisition, we're taking a really targeted eye to tackling our issues with overcrowding. So there are regions within the state where we're seeing park closures due to capacity exceedances, and we're focusing money into those areas. We're also looking at the opportunities for our park protection to really support cultural resources, looking at African American, Asian, Indigenous, and Latino populations and important cultural areas that we can protect using some of these park properties. Also, as I'm sure most people are aware of in Maryland, it's really hard to access our waterfront, heavily held in private lands. So we're looking at opportunities to protect more beaches and waterfront property. Speaking about how we're going to do this, we have two positions that have recently been filled in our land acquisition and planning, and I'm speaking just about the system improvement funding, and one more that's in the recruitment process. So we're increasing our land acquisition planning staff ability to be able to protect these properties and create these parks. Moving over to the State Lakes project, or the State Lakes pieces, the amount of funding for the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund does provide us with opportunities to put strategic projects to maintain the lakes. We're looking at some preliminary dredge work in different lakes to make sure that people can still access them, use them for boating. When we look at the governor's budget, that includes the $1 million for the Mel Nolan Woodland Incentive Program. I think this is a really interesting space where we're kind of plussing up some cost share programs. We're helping forest owners keep forest as forest. We're helping them manage those properties successfully. And we're actually looking at opportunities for forest carbon, so private incentives to be able to keep forests in these forested programs. Also looking at opportunities for increasing our forest stewardship plans. That's really important for us as a state to make sure that we're working with landowners. We have a good eye of how people are managing and maintaining their forests. When we look at the park staff and volunteers, there's a significant increase for us in being able to increase the staff. What we have in a lot of places are parks that are cluster parks. So being able to increase staffing in those spaces so we're not having staff kind of drive all over to manage these parks is going to increase and improve not only our ability to manage the property, but the visitor experience that they're going to receive there as well. We're looking at also the fact that we're going to be able to increase our planning staff. So our natural resource planning staff to be able to take that longer look at our parks. How do we maintain them, keep them in good working order? We want to make sure the bathrooms work and everybody's really happy to be there. We also are excited we're going to hire a statewide volunteer coordinator. Our parks are really places where people gather, they congregate. We have friends of parks groups all over the state, and so a volunteer coordinator to help really manage and make sure that program is running successfully. In terms of our management of the infrastructure in the parks, we are partnering with DLS on the study and looking at procurement to identify an independent contractor to help develop that long-range strategic plan for our parks. We want to make sure that while we have a great park system now, we have an even better park system in 5 years, an even better park system in 10, and so on and so forth. In terms of new park amenities and considerations, we did establish and convene an advisory group that kind of guided the development of the Freedman State Historical Park in Montgomery County. We've submitted a report with recommendations concerning the creation of the Port Deposit State Historical Park using property that was formerly Bainbridge, as well as a report on the possible reopening of Fort Tonalo State Park. That brings me into our engineering and construction unit. Again, this is an area where we're working really hard to increase that unit. We know that this is going to be a challenge for us. I think maybe even the largest challenge when we look at our successful implementation of the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. Moving to the Office of Outdoor Recreation. Outdoor recreation is a growing industry here in Maryland all across the state. We're seeing a wide range of opportunities to engage with people not just in our rural communities, but all across our urban centers as well. Our executive director has been working closely with the Department of Commerce to increase some of these opportunities. But one I wanted to highlight for you today is the B360 Club in Baltimore City. And what this does is it actually kind of brings people who are participating in kind of the dirt bike culture within the city. It introduces them to our natural recreation areas, and it helps them kind of get connected to that pipeline of STEM education, as well as opportunities to use our natural resources. We're also working with colleges, vocational schools, really trying to build that pipeline. I think Mr. Gray touched on this with Natural Resource Police, but I think also across the department more generally. We're not a very diverse agency. We do not look like the state of Maryland, and a lot of that is because the people that use our parks and our natural resources tend to look like the agency. So we need to work really hard to not only improve diversity within the agency, but within the users of our natural resources. Speaking of that $1 million that was appropriated for the Office of Outdoor Recreation, we have an RFP for a governmental or non-governmental organization that's capable of managing the apprentice program for us to really help beef up this economic opportunity we have in the Office of Outdoor Recreation. I want to turn now to the Natural Resources Police. The Natural Resources Police diversity plan, which we've been working on, is something that we're actually reevaluating now as a department. There were 3 subgroups that were put together to make recommendations to create the plan, and I think there were several recommendations that did not make the plan that are very worthwhile and something that we need to consider. When you look at our current class, we have 15 officer candidates with a 40% diversity rate. So 6 candidates out of the 15 meet diversity criteria, although I will point out that many of those are not actually, that it's primarily white women that make up that diversity rate. So we still have a long way to go with black females, black males, Hispanics, Asians. So we need to think really long and hard about how we get to the numbers that are highlighted in that 2027 goal. And I think it does come back to reevaluating the plan and making sure that it's as good as possible. We also have suspended our recruitment for this coming year. We are looking at opportunities to really push that recruitment length so that we're bringing more people into the fold. We're able to go to places that we haven't really recruited before. We're engaging with Spanish language speaking radio stations, things like that, really trying to be creative on the front end to make sure that we have a very deep and diverse pool of candidates. As Mr. Gray said, we do tend to lose a lot of folks along the way. In terms of moving now into our budget recommendation language, we respectfully disagree with the recommendation of restricting the funding pending submission of the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Base Trust Fund. The draft annual work plan is developed on November 1st, and we've been making them available to DBM and DLS for comment and review. So we would respectfully disagree with that recommendation. Moving now to adopting the narrative requesting a report on Chesapeake Bay restoration spending, DNR does concur with that recommendation by the Department of Legislative Services. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Thank you, Secretary Kurtz. First of all, I want to shout out a predecessor in one of my jobs, former Delegate Lukey, for the Great Maryland Outdoors Act, which he was a huge impetus behind. On issue number 3, the NRP hiring and promotion plan status report. First of all, more shout outs, Senator Bailey, Delegate Sample Hughes, Delegate Resnick have been much more involved in that issue than I have. But your response was mostly focused on the recruitment. Part of it was about the promotion plan aspect and how we're sort of growing from within. So I'm hoping you can talk about that. And then I would also ask, well, go ahead.
No, yes. And so the recruitment is one where we're trying to figure out how we can be creative. There is also a SLEOLA bargaining agreement in place that covers all of our law enforcement officers across the state. And that does kind of bind our hands a little bit more. So that's another reason that we want to go back to the report. We did not, I think, investigate that as well as we could have with our subgroups.
Okay. And I would just encourage you to work closely with the Natural Resources Black Officers Association. They've been very involved in this issue. They're in a lot of our inboxes regularly on this, and so just want to make sure you're working closely with them, which I'm not sure historically was always happening. So
yes, sir. The leadership was in my office this morning. So
terrific. I was going to ask you met with them yet, so that's fantastic. Any other Delegate Edelson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to ask about the B360 program. I don't know a lot about it, but it sounds like an excellent program. If you have any more, just a little more context and details for us, I'm happy to work with you offline to get a bit more understanding of that.
absolutely, and I can send that over to you. Yeah, our executive director has been working closely with the executive director of that program, and it's one where I think we see a lot of opportunity for growth. This is, we just started this engagement, so we're just kind of putting the plan together of how we engage, but I'll send over everything we have.
Great, thank you so much.
Vice Chair Watson.
It's great to have you heading the department, so thank you for all the work that you're doing. I just wanted to clarify with the Great Maryland Outdoors Act and the study that is required. The analysis said that a contractor had been hired. Is that accurate? I thought you said that you were in the process of.
Sorry, the contractor I was talking, Mr. Gray, I don't know if you'd like to take that.
That's actually has hired that contractor.
Okay, and the kickoff meeting is?
March 9th, I think it is.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, I do not see any other questions for the Department of Natural Resources, so thank you both for being here. We do have a couple of public witnesses on this testimony. I'll call up John Corn from Bike Maryland and Tim Casey from Friends of Maryland State Parks. Thank you both for being here, and you'll each have 2 minutes. And John, why don't you, right when you sit down, just go ahead and start.
Thank you, Chairman Kurtz, Vice Chair Watson, members of the subcommittee. My name is John Corrin, President of Bicycle Advocates for Annapolis and Anne Arundel County, but today representing a broad coalition of advocacy organizations across the state of Maryland. We envision a Maryland-wide trail network which can be used by people for recreation, for access to nature, and perhaps most importantly, for active transportation, to get around without use of a car, either by choice or for Marylanders that may have no other choice, to be able to safely get from origin to destination on foot or bike. Municipalities across the state have trail network visions. We have one here in Anne Arundel County, Baltimore Greenway, Capital Trails Coalition, Salisbury has one. What we lack is a coordinating body at the state level to help us knit all these trail networks together, and also to take advantage of state trails and state parklands, which may be used to connect these trails. So we welcome Secretary Kurtz to his new role and would hope to work with him to this end. Some of our neighboring states have done this. Virginia has created an Office of Trails to coordinate these activities statewide. Delaware has done the same thing. And we would like to see an Office of Trails established at DNR to work with local jurisdictions, MDOT, National Park Service, and others. We would also like to see DNR relax its regulation on the use of e-bikes. E-bikes are accessibility devices. I meet loads of seniors on e-bikes tell me they wouldn't be on a bike if not for the e-assist. But DNR's current regulation is very, very restrictive. And so again, with trying to get these trails used for recreation and transportation, we would like to see that opened up. We'd like to see more money in the capital budget and operating budget for trails. Again, not just for recreation, but importantly, for active transportation. Thank you.
My name is Tim Casey. I'm with the volunteer with the Friends of Maryland State Parks. We're an all-volunteer nonprofit. We fully advocate full funding for the governor's 2024 budget, and specifically not to cut the DNR and specifically the Maryland Park Service operating budget. One item I'd like to bring up in the human resource management area is from the GMO Act, all the kind of holes are filled after exhaustive study of all the issues in the parks over the decades. And from Secretary Kurtz's comments and from Mr. Gray's analysis, one item I'd like to talk about, and that is the Park Service staff has grown about 4.6% in the last decade, a little bit more than a decade, and in that same decade, the visitorship has doubled. So there's an imbalance in the visitors coming to the parks and the amenities that, not the amenities they see, but the staff that greets them and takes care of our natural resources. There is an issue with the recruitment and hiring system for the Park Service that's been regulated by DBM with a history of slowing down this process, even when the budget and the PINs have been appropriated by the governor. This is a long-standing issue and is an extraordinary problem. Just a couple of data points. FY22, there were approved 262 PINs. FY23, additional 14 to 276. And then FY24 appropriation up to 351. The reality is, as of February 20th, there are 247 filled classified Park Service employees with 27 vacancies. That's a 10% vacancy. It's not quite double what it had been historically. I gave you these numbers just to give you, to define the scope of this challenge. I'm here to reiterate that human resource management is an issue and it requires best practice to streamline the effectiveness and efficiency of the system. The Friends respectfully request the legislature support the DNR and the Park Service in any way possible to correct this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Casey, and thanks to the Friends of the Maryland State Parks for helping keep our parks in such good shape alongside DNR and the Park Service. Are there any questions for these witnesses? Okay, well, thank you both for being here. Colleagues, we'll now turn to the Maryland Department of Transportation debt service requirements. Our analyst is Steve McCulloch, and while he's presenting, Secretary Wiedefeld and whoever you need from your team, feel free to come to the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The debt service analysis is kind of a technical analysis for the department. There are no personnel involved, so this is fairly short. The Department of Transportation issues 15-year consolidated transportation bonds, or CTBs. These are tax-supported debt. They also rely on what's referred to as non-traditional debt, which is any debt instruments that is not a CTB or a grant anticipation revenue vehicle, or GARVI bond. You can see with the exhibit operating summary that the fiscal 2024 allowance for debt service decreases by $54 million, or 11.2%. That's largely driven by the fact that there are no planned debt issuances of CTBs in 2023. Now, the state law and bond covenants and agency practices limit the amount of CTB debt with three criteria. First, there is an overall debt limit in statute of $4.5 billion. That last time that was increased was back in 2013. So CTBs must remain within that level. Every year during the budget process, statute also requires the General Assembly to adopt a fiscal year debt outstanding limit, and you'll see that in the recommended action section that falls within that 4.5 cap. Then there are also two debt service coverage tests that apply. The first is a net income test, which is the ratio of the prior year's income, excluding federal capital contributions, bond proceeds, and third-party reimbursements, minus the prior year operating expenses and debt service payments. So that amount has to be at least 2.0 times maximum future debt service. The second income test is very similar. It's called the pledged tax coverage test, and that is the ratio of the prior year net revenues from pledged taxes, which include the vehicle excise tax, motor fuel tax, rental car, and corporate income taxes, also excluding refunds and statutory deductions, again, applying that to the maximum future debt ratio. Now, the department has had a long-held administrative practice of maintaining at least 2.5 times coverage. That gives them a little bit of leeway if things start getting pinched. Because if either of those coverage ratios fall below 2.0 times future maximum debt service, the bond covenants prohibit the department from selling any future debt until that ratio has increased above that level. Based on the current revenue projections and debt issuance projections, the CTP, these ratios will remain above the minimum acceptable levels for the entire forecast. Exhibit 1 on page 3 shows the bonds issued, the debt service, and the resulting debt outstanding. So the bonds issued are the green bars, the debt service are the blue bars, and the debt outstanding is the red line. And you can see that debt issuances really started increasing following, from 2014 on. In 2013 session, that's when the gas tax was last raised by including an indexing to inflation and a sales and use tax equivalent. And with that additional revenue, the department started increasing its bond sales, as you can see from the green bars. That kind of peaked in 2017, started coming down in 2019, and you can see again, 2023, there's no planned issuances. Because of those increasing issuances, obviously debt service starts to increase, as does the debt outstanding. But with the tail off of the debt issuances, as these minimum ratios have been approached, that's where we see the decrease in both debt service and debt outstanding. But you can see that projected for this forecast period, it is expected they'll start increasing their issuances a little bit in 24 and then more through the end of the forecast period. Exhibit 2, which starts on page 14 and goes for several pages, shows the non-traditional debt issuances that are outstanding. The department currently has 11 direct non-traditional debt outstandings. That's debt that they have been issued upon either by the department itself or had other conduit issuers issue it. And there are also 2 indirect, which are basically the debt related to the Purple Line, because that debt is actually the debt of the Purple Line Transit Partners, not the state. But we do show it as non-traditional debt because the payment of that debt, although the P3 partner will be paying it, their revenue source is the availability payments the state will start paying once that transit system is operational. There are 3 recommended actions, annual recommended actions. The first was what I'd mentioned. There's a requirement to set the overall debt limit for the fiscal year. This is set just by looking at what debt has already been issued and then planned issuances, and sets it at the end of that amount. So that's issue number 1. Recommendation number 2, annual report language for the non-traditional debt that we use to help put together this analysis. And the third recommendation is to set non-traditional debt limits. And again, this is not really trying to limit the department, but more it sets the limit at what is the expectation, with language allows them to increase that if they come in and notify committees prior to issuing additional debt. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Any questions for Steve? Okay, thank you, Steve. We'll now turn to Secretary Wiedefeld.
Good afternoon, Chair Corman and members of the committee. For the record, I am Paul Wiedefeld, Secretary of Transportation. I'd like to thank Steve McCulloch for the work he did on this analysis and for his knowledge of MDOT's operations. The DLS analysts included 3 pieces of annual budget bill language, and MDOT concurs with all 3. With all 3. That concludes my remarks. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions for the Secretary? I'm sure they'll all be this easy. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Don't go far. Colleagues, we will now turn to the Maryland Transportation Authority Our analyst is Carrie Cook, and Mr. Pines, feel free to come on up while we hear from Ms. Cook when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Carrie Cook presenting the analysis for the Maryland Transportation Authority. So the authority has the exclusive authority for the supervision, construction, and maintenance of all the tolling facilities throughout the state. Any capital projects that occur on the tolling facilities are going to be under MDTA rather than under SHA or a different section of MDOT. You can see here on the cover chart, the FY 2024 budget increases $12.1 million or 2.3% to $537.1 million. And on the PAYGO capital side, on page 2, the budget increases $93.5 million or 17.5% to $627.9 million. Turning now to page 5, the managing for results. The first issue here is regarding EasyPass. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with the EasyPass transponders that you can mount on your windshield. So this chart here is showing the percentage of tolls that are collected using those EasyPass transponders. So as you can imagine, using EasyPass reduces the cost to both the customer and the agency. It is more efficient to just go through and have that connection with the transponder, and the toll rate is actually lower for the customer when using that EasyPass. So you can see here on Exhibit 1, 92.7% tolls collected using EasyPass in fiscal 2021. I will note that that number is slightly inflated, and that is just due to how the agency was processing the toll backlog. And you can see it comes back down a little bit in fiscal 2022 to 86%. So the agency expects that that rate is going to remain pretty steady. You can also see here that they increased their goal, which is the red line, to 86%, just to be more reflective of their current trends. And obviously, we hope that that continues to increase to promote efficiencies. So the agency should discuss the challenges in fiscal 2021 regarding the backlog and the AET processing, and the agency's efforts in prioritizing both EasyPass and video tolls as they worked through that backlog. Exhibit number 2 shows the proposed budget. So the overall budget for the authority increased by $12.1 million. In personnel, there was a net increase of $14.2 million, due mostly to salary increases. There was a decrease in their operational expenses of a net of $6.3 million. You can see some increases here in engineering and road costs. Those are basically just getting back to pre-pandemic levels. There was a decrease in some of these costs due to the substantial decrease in traffic. And you can see a substantial decrease here in the EasyPass Service Center. And that cost reduction is due to the agency getting through the backlog of tolls, and so they didn't have as many overtime staff working at the service center. Some other changes is an increase of about $8 million from the previous year in debt service. These are just bond payment costs that fluctuate year to year based on the outstanding debt. And then there's also a reduction in equipment purchases down towards the bottom there. That's due to several vehicles for their police force being purchased in FY 2023. So moving on to Exhibit 3 on page 8, this shows the revenue sources for the agency. So you can see that about 3/4 of the revenue comes from tolls. There is another 20% from bond proceeds. Intergovernmental revenue, which is 6% there, is reimbursements from other sections of MDOT. So MDTA Police provides policing and law enforcement services at both BWI Airport and the Port of Baltimore. There is also intergovernmental revenue from loans that MDTA has loaned funding to both the Secretary's Office and MAA. I will also note here that there was $200 million. It's not reflected in this chart since it needs to be paid back, but $200 million for the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or TIFIA, loan. That was to support the Nice Middleton Replacement Bridge project, which replaced the bridge and recently opened to traffic. Again, that's not reflected in this chart, but I did just want to note it because it occurred in fiscal 2023. Last year, they were expecting it to occur in fiscal 2024, that loan. Exhibit 4 on page 9 shows the use of funding. So you can see a little bit over half of their funding here was used to support their capital program, followed by debt service, their law enforcement personnel, and other operating costs here. And then moving on to Exhibit 5 on page 10, this is their bond sales and debt outstanding. So I did want to note here that since MDTA's finances are separate from the rest of MDOT, they are not subject to the state debt limitations. They have separate financial standards, which I'll discuss in just a moment. So you can see here the bond sales in each year, and also the TIFIA loan that I just mentioned is reflected there in the green. The yellow line is the total debt outstanding over the years. And I did also want to note that on the right axis, the $3 billion there, because it's in millions, that is their statutory limit for total debt outstanding. So it is going up as they're continue to pursue an aggressive capital program, not really in danger of reaching that limit anytime soon. In terms of debt affordability, as I mentioned before, there are individual standards that MDTA adheres to. Some of them are in statute, some of them were enacted by the board themselves, and so there's details there on page 11. I will discuss that in one of the issues in just a few moments. Exhibit 6 on page 12 shows non-recourse debt. So this is debt that MDTA issues on behalf of other agencies, and it does not affect their finances or their debt outstanding. So I'm just going to skip that. Page 13 shows their personnel information. So you can see in the fiscal 2024 budget, they have a reduction of 10 positions. These are vacant toll collector positions that are no longer needed due to the conversion to all electronic tolling. And I did also want to highlight the vacancy rate here. MDTA, as I mentioned, is non-budgeted, so they are not under DBM in terms of personnel. They do budget a 10% vacancy rate, and their current vacancy rate as of February 1st is 18.4%, so that's over 150 positions over their budgeted turnover rate. And I did also want to note here that some of the positions have been vacant for a decent amount of time. So 8% have been vacant for 1 year or more, and 4% have been vacant for 2 years or more. They do have particular challenges here with law enforcement positions, partially due to the small window in terms of hiring because of how the training academy, in terms of the timeline for each year. The agency also noted that they had a higher than usual amount of retirements. Almost 20% of their separations in the past year were retirements, and that is fairly unusual for them. One reason for their high vacancy rate is an internal extension of the DBM hiring freeze that was put in place during the pandemic in order to control their finances and continue to, given the reduced revenues, they did extend that hiring freeze a little bit longer than DBM's hiring freeze. They did review exceptions on a case-by-case basis, and you can see there at the bottom of page 13 some of the considerations that they took into account there. Page 14 describes the actions that the agency has taken to try and fill their vacant positions. I wanted to highlight the centralization of onboarding procedures, hiring a career counselor to manage an apprenticeship program, conducting stay interviews rather than exit interviews for existing employees, creating a mentorship program, and establishing a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. So the agency should discuss the high vacancy rate, particularly how long-term vacancies may have impacted critical operations, including customer support and public safety during operational challenges during the pandemic. The agency should also be prepared to discuss the rationale for the extended hiring freeze and if it substantially offset the reduced revenues as was intended. They should also discuss specific strategies to reduce the vacancy rate or consolidate unneeded positions. Moving now to the capital program, which starts on page 15. Exhibit 7 shows the 6-year PAYGO allowance, which totaled $2.7 billion. Exhibit 8 on page 16 shows the capital funding by MDTA facility. So 84% of their funding is with just 3 facilities, the Bay Bridge, I-95, and the Nice-Middleton Bridge. And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, the replacement Nice-Middleton Bridge did open to traffic, so the bulk of the funding for that project has been expended. And authority-wide consists of system-wide preservation, so mostly this includes the conversion to the 3rd-generation electronic toll collection system. Exhibit 9, which starts on page 17, shows capital projects that are funded in fiscal 2024, and it's broken out by the facility, as the previous chart is. And then Exhibit 10 on page 19 shows the major changes from the previous year's CTP. So you can see the projects that appeared in the construction and the development and evaluation programs for the first time. Turning now to the issues section of the analysis. The first issue describes the financial outlook for the agency. So the agency is required to semi-annually submit financial forecasts, and this reflects the same 6-year period as in the rest of MDOT's Consolidated Transportation Program. So this year is fiscal 2022 to 2028. As I mentioned earlier, MDTA has separate financial standards that they have adopted. So you can see those on Exhibit 11, and they are not subject to the state borrowing standards. So these are standards either that have been created as a policy by the MDTA board or in statute. And Exhibit 12 shows a summary of the latest financial forecast, which was just released a few weeks ago. So you can see here their revenues and expenses and projected for all the years except for fiscal 2022, their annual cash surplus and deficit, and then that translates to their cash balance. You can also see here the actual values for the 4 financial standards that are explained in Exhibit 11. So I just wanted to highlight here the debt service coverage in that very last column reaches 2.0 in fiscal 2028. That is the minimum allowable level per the MDTA policy. So what debt service coverage is they hope that net revenues want to be more than 2 times the annual debt service. So annual revenues for the year, they want to use less than half of those revenues to cover their debt service obligations for the same year. So you can see that this coverage is declining throughout the duration of the forecast, and that's due to the revenues projected to decline slightly, as well as the aggressive capital program. The only other standard that is approaching its limit is the unencumbered cash, which is required to be $350 million or more. It is $350.3 million projected in fiscal 2024. So the agency notes regarding the debt service coverage that a large portion of that is increased personnel expenses that are sort of compounding through the forecast. Part of that is collectively bargained salary and cost of living increases for both their civilian and their law enforcement personnel. And the reason that I highlight this is that the agency uses this measure to decide when to increase toll rates. So the agency should comment on its strategies to mitigate projected fiscal challenges in the years to come, including a potential toll increase. I also just wanted to mention here the customer assistance plan that waived $182 million in civil penalties. They are still evaluating the long-term financial effect of these waivers, if any. And the agency did also note that another goal of the plan was to register folks into getting MDTA accounts rather than just getting that video toll bill in the mail. They did register 76,000 drivers, and 98% of those accounts remain open to date. So that reduces costs, as I mentioned, for both the customer and the agency and promotes efficiency in the tolling process. The second issue here is a follow-up on the pandemic-related backlogs and the customer assistance plan. So there were substantial backlogs created by the pandemic, both in the ICC, which suspended toll collections for a brief period, and in pausing the collection of video tolls for several months in 2020. So the agency completed posting all the backlog tolls in September 2021, but what this created for many customers was receiving a lot of tolls all at once, some of which they didn't even know or remember that they had gone through in the first place. So this created a lot of confusion with a lot of the customers, and so to acknowledge and assist the customers through this, the MDTA board implemented a customer assistance plan which started in late February. So what this plan did was waive any late fees associated with the tolls for customers who paid their toll balance in full during the plan. So it did not waive the tolls themselves, but waived rather the late fees that were associated as long as you got your balance situated during the duration of the plan. So you can see here on Exhibit 13, this is the call center volume. So as you can imagine, The amount of calls as folks started to get those very large bills was very high in February, and then it starts to decrease quite dramatically. As I mentioned, the plan was implemented in late February. So the MDTA made extensive efforts to promote this plan, emails to the General Assembly. It was on their website. It was on social media. So as they started to promote that and folks were taking advantage, getting their toll balances down, their call volume significantly decreased. You can also see a spike here in November. That was due to the plan originally ending on December 1st. So that was the folks who waited until the last minute to get it done. Acknowledging the spike that happened there, the board did extend the plan to December 15th, just kind of giving those stragglers a little extra time to get that situated. And relatedly, Exhibit 14 shows the wait times at the call center. So you can see, again, in February, quite a high wait time. And then from March to July, the wait time averaged less than 1 minute. And then again, you can see a spike there in November prior to the end of the plan. Another issue that was identified last year was the lack of call agents at the call center. So the previous year had a low of only 60 agents, but from February 2022 to January 2023, they averaged 280 agents. So they have improved on that quite remarkably. And in terms of the totals, $182 million in civil penalties were waived for approximately 837,000 drivers and businesses. There was also a bill that passed last year regarding civil penalties that were paid in error during the plan. So folks that paid those late fees during the plan when they didn't have to. So the MTTA did an internal assessment to identify accounts that paid these civil penalties when they didn't need to. They identified over 56,000 accounts and issued nearly $3.2 million in reimbursements. They organized the reimbursements based on amount of toll debt. So if a customer paid the penalty but didn't have any toll debt, they received a full reimbursement. If they had toll debt outstanding, the reimbursement was applied to that toll debt, and then the difference, if any, was reimbursed. And then the last issue for this agency is the Oplanes Maryland project, which you also heard about in the MDOT overview. So this project seeks to add high occupancy toll lanes to congested areas, but keep the general purpose lanes free. So there was a record of decision issued by the Federal Highway Administration, and there has been a construction contractor that was onboarded in September. The next step is the submission of the proposal for design and construction, which is due in late March. The current administration will decide if a P3 agreement will be submitted for review. There are also still some unresolved issues related to a bid protest. So the agency should comment on the future of this project and when a decision will be made given the significant investments that are planned for the project. In the update section, there is a summary of a required JCR report, which is on tolling accuracy concerns. And there are no recommendations for this agency because it is non-budgeted. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Carrie. Any questions for the analyst? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you, Carrie. We'll now turn to MDTA for Secretary Wiedefeld.
Thank you again, Chairman Corbin, members of the subcommittee. For the record, it is Paul Wiedefeld, Secretary of Transportation. I do want to thank Carrie Cook for her work throughout the year and a strong partnership we have with DLS. I'm joined today by William Pines, Executive Director of the Maryland Transportation Authority. Before turning it over to Will to address the DLS analysts, I'd like to highlight several important accomplishments that occurred over the last year. Despite continued challenges associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Toll Authority maintained its financial standards while funding multiple system preservation improvement projects, such as the I-95 Express Toll Lanes northbound extension, the Belvedere Road Interchange Project in Cecil County, and eastbound Bay Bridge rehabilitation. And the Toll Authority maintained its AA2 credit ratings and continued to be among the 5 highest rated tolling utilities within Moody's. Let me close by saying that MDTA is poised to build on the recent success to deliver the governor's vision for transportation equity, environmental protection, and engagement for all Marylanders. I will now turn it over to Will Pines to discuss the DLS analysts.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Corman and members of the subcommittee. As Secretary Wiedefeld mentioned, I'm Will Pines, Executive Director for the Maryland Transportation Authority. I've proudly served the department for nearly 19 years now, formerly at State Highway Administration, and now with the MDTA for the last 13 years. The last few years have been challenging for the transportation sector. I'm pleased to report that the MDTA weathered through the financial challenges that stem from the COVID-19 pandemic, while continuing to focus on core operations and now delivering on the governor's vision for better, cleaner, and more equitable transportation infrastructure. Transportation issues touch each of us, and I am proud to be part of an agency that seeks to provide the best facilities and customer service for the traveling public now and into the future. I'd like to thank Ms. Cook for her work, and I will now address the areas of the DLS analysis where we were requested to comment. On page 5 of the analysis, DLS asks that we discuss the AET challenges during FY22 and efforts to prioritize the processing of E-ZPass and video tolls while working through the backlog. In response to the pandemic, the MDTA paused the collection of video tolls from March of 2020 to October of 2020. The MDTA subsequently began mailing notices of toll due to the impacted customers. In FY 2021, as part of the MDTA's strategy to address the pandemic backlog of unprocessed transactions, the MDTA emphasized processing home and away agency E-ZPass transactions. This led to a temporary artificial increase in the FY 2021 E-ZPass collection rate. In FY 2022, the MDTA focused on processing and collecting delayed notices of toll due mailings, which led to a reduction in the E-ZPass penetration rate. In September of 2022, the MDTA completed posting online at driveeasymd.com all Maryland toll customers' tolls that were deferred during the COVID-19 pandemic. Going forward, the MDTA anticipates a relatively flat E-ZPass collection rate of approximately 86% of the total transactions. And now I'll move on to the requested discussion on vacancies. On page 14 of the analysis, DLS asks us to comment on our high vacancy rate and to discuss how long-term vacancies have impacted critical operations during and after the pandemic. We were also asked to discuss the rationale for extending the hiring freeze, its financial impact, and strategies to reduce the vacancy rate. Like many other state agencies and businesses, the MDTA was not immune from staffing shortages and retention challenges that stem from the pandemic. The high vacancy rate has resulted in additional employee overtime and compensatory leave. And while the benefits associated with overtime and compensatory leave are often appreciated by staff, it can lead to employee fatigue and retention issues. Because the MDTA is a self-funded agency, we are faced with challenges not encountered by many other state agencies that have access to alternate funding sources. As shown in the graph on page 3 of the MDTA's budget responses, to help mitigate the impact of the nearly $375 million reduction in revenues from the temporary decline in tolled traffic during the pandemic, the MDTA implemented a hiring freeze. This action was no different than every other state agency. However, because of MDTA's independent and unique financial structure, the MDTA found it necessary to further extend the hiring freeze beyond the state-mandated timeframe. This enabled the MDTA to further constrain costs in order to maintain its operations, comply with the legal standards and operating policies, as well as preserve its toll revenue bond credit ratings. While extending the hiring freeze was a challenging decision, this action, in conjunction with other mitigating actions, such as reducing our capital budget, delaying capital projects, and pursuing innovative financing, were all viewed as a much better alternative than long-term permanent actions. Throughout the duration of the hiring freeze, sworn personnel were excluded from the hiring freeze, and exceptions were granted for critical civilian positions on a case-by-case basis. As noted on page 14 of the DLS analysis, the MDTA has deployed multiple practical and creative solutions to help reduce the vacancy rate and to retain employees, such as prioritizing our human resources vacancies and hiring a career counselor to manage an apprenticeship program for hard-to-fill trade positions. The MDTA continuously seeks to find ways to enhance our hiring practices to fill vacant positions as quickly as possible. Now I'm going to turn to issue number 1. On page 21 of the analysis, DLS requests we comment on our strategies to mitigate projected fiscal challenges, including a potential toll increase. The timing of a toll increase is dependent on many factors that impact the MDTA's financial standards, such as inflationary pressures, deferred maintenance policies, toll revenue attainment, mandated operating budget increases, and debt issuance costs and timing. While in the past the MDTA has been able to strategically constrain expenses to manage its financial standards and the timing of a toll increase, the construction market volatility and rising inflationary pressures may make it difficult for the MDTA to defer maintenance in order to constrain the budget while also maintaining its facilities in a state of good repair as required by the MDTA's trust agreement with bondholders. The agency will continue to monitor its fiscal position and, in consultation with its financial advisors and the MDTA board, take the necessary actions to meet its financial obligations. Moving on to issue 3, on page 26 of the analysis, DLS asks that we comment on the future of the Op Lanes Maryland project and when a decision will be made regarding the future of the project. This project will be viewed under the same lenses of social equity, environmental protection, and local participation as all other transportation projects. The MDTA and MDOT will continue to work with all our partners, including local stakeholders, toward a solution for congestion in the Washington suburbs along portions of the I-495 and I-270 corridor, as well as addressing maintenance and safety on the American Legion Bridge in a way that meets the needs of Marylanders. The DLS analysis did not include any recommended actions, to which we certainly concur. And with that, we want to thank the subcommittee for your time and are happy to address any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Director Pines. On the personnel, and forgive me, I should have this data, but you've obviously already implemented a number of items. They were mentioned by Ms. Cook. You cited a few of them there. So are you seeing a positive trend line? I mean, because 18.4% is extremely high. I mean, the agencies that our speaker is talking about that we're worried are too high are like 13%, so 18% is extremely high. Are you seeing, there's a lot of things in here you're doing, but are you seeing the actual results of those things?
I just got an update before this hearing. We're now at 17.7%. So it's positive. We have had a number of attrition challenges too. Last year during 2022, 19% of the folks that left state service at MDTA were retirements. So you gain some, you lose some, and we're working through those challenges.
Yeah, I'm going to do something bold here and make a suggestion, which is the Maryland Environmental Service, which is run by an MDOT vet like yourself, Dr. Glass, just put out a white paper about how they dealt with their vacancy rate, which they cut in half from about 10% to 5% in about 6 months. And they have a lot of similarities with you because they are a non-budgeted agency, so you might be interested in taking a look at that or talking to your friend, Dr. Glass. Other questions for MDTA? Vice Chair Watson?
Thank you. Thanks for being here today. And I want to compliment you, start off by complimenting you on the tolling accuracy report. And it definitely showed us that you are meeting or exceeding industry standards, and that's fantastic news. I do want to ask you about the customer assistance plan. So I understand the plan, and I understand that the $182 million that we did not collect, some of it was, as a result of the unfortunate circumstances around the pandemic. But I'm curious how that decision was made. Was that a decision that was made by the director, or was it something that was presented and approved by the board?
Could you ask the question again?
Are you asking about the customer assistance plan?
Customer assistance plan? So the MDTA board took an action in February of 2022 approving to advance the customer assistance plan and provided the specific details that it would include and required us to bring on more call center agents to get our call wait times down, and had all of the specific policy directives on how to implement the plan were included in that approval.
Okay, good. And in relation to that, does the board have a set of bylaws?
There are a number of requirements related to the MDTA board and statute, and then we do have an operating policy that governs what aspects of our agency are controlled by the board, and then what aspects are delegated to staff and myself.
Okay, so you do not have bylaws? Okay, I'm just asking because this came up with another non-budgeted agency, so I was curious about the parallels or not.
Yeah, I don't think we technically refer to them as bylaws, but our operating policy does govern our actions.
Okay, thank you. A stay interview. Could you define that for us?
Sure. So, I talked a little bit about with Delegate Corman, the chair, on attrition challenges. And a stay interview is, rather than just doing a performance evaluation for an employee where you're kind of giving them corrective actions to work on, it's getting their perspectives on how they feel day to day in their work environment, and sort of more or less getting a sense for how the employee feels as part of the team.
And is that done on a regular basis?
Yeah, as part of the program that we've launched, it is a program that,
Okay.
we do
I
on a reoccurring
want
basis.
to let you know that you're the only agency that I remember coming before us that has mentioned using that tactic, and I think it's positive. And should be employed really in these times by every organization. So I'm glad to hear that you're doing that, and I hope that you keep it up on a regular basis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions? Delegate Edelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under the all-electronic tolling system, is the idea that anybody that does not have an Easy Pass will get the bill sent to them in the mail in perpetuity? That's sort of for the foreseeable future, that's how that will operate?
So technically today there are 4 ways to pay. If one is via an Easy Pass, which we always prefer, customers receive the lowest toll rates and have the most convenience with Easy Pass. And as was mentioned, 86% of our customers utilize that. It offers discount plans and a lot of features. Then what we call that our best option. The next one down, better, is referred to as pay by plate. That's where if a customer is kind of an infrequent traveler and doesn't want to have a transponder, they can link their license plate to their credit card so that when we take that image of their plate, it can get charged directly to the card. However, that system only works in the state of Maryland. So a customer with a pay-by-plate account with us can't go to Delaware or New York and have it operate in the same way that Easy Pass does. The third option is what you mentioned, what we refer to as video tolling, where we take a picture, we'll look up the license plate through the Motor Vehicle Administration and mail the customer a toll. And then the final and the newest option that we have available is we have partnered with some private mobile applications where customers can download a mobile app and provide their license plate and credit card information to that third party and pay their tolls through the app. That is not direct tolling with us, but we will receive the payment from that third-party company.
And in the scenario where a customer is an Easy Pass customer, but for whatever reason, when they're driving through the particular toll, doesn't recognize the Easy Pass, the transponder, in that scenario, does it still get billed to the Easy Pass account that's set up through your system, or would they then get the regular sort of license video toll?
So this was actually addressed in the JCR report on tolling accuracy. The most predominant case when that happens is either the customer doesn't have their transponder mounted or the transponder is not in the vehicle at all, not detectable in the vehicle.
Sure.
So read accuracy-wise, if it is mounted properly, nearly 100% of the time it will read. When a customer doesn't have it mounted and we have to read the license plate, they're charged what's referred to as an image toll rate. It is that their license plate has to be on that Easy Pass account in order for them to receive that image toll rate, but it is reduced below the video toll rate. It actually matches the pay-by-plate, because a pay-by-plate where we read your plate and charge your credit card, it is essentially the same transaction if we do that for an Easy Pass customer.
And sorry, just one more, Mr. Chair. And in that scenario, is the payment automatically debited against the Easy Pass account, or would the person get the notification in the mail that they would then have to affirmatively go on?
It is automatically debited against their account. That's correct. And an image toll, or what we refer to as an I-toll, comes directly on their Easy Pass statement. We really do encourage education about proper transponder mounting because in addition to receiving an image toll, discount plans the terms and conditions requires that customers have a transponder read. So if it's not read, they don't have the benefit of the discount plan, or they also receive the higher I-toll rate as well.
Understood. Great. Thanks so much.
Director Pines, I'm getting to be a grizzled vet. I remember when your predecessor said we didn't need a replacement for the Harry Nice Bridge, and now we have a brand new Nice Middleton Bridge. So can you tell us how that's working out?
So far, it's been really great. Had a nice conversation recently. The secretary joined me at one of our police graduations, and some of our MDTA police were there, and we're noting how few incidents that they've observed on the new bridge. We are on time, ahead of schedule actually, and under budget for the program. So I think the local community has received the new bridge very positively. The existing bridge is being demolished at this point. That was something that commenced essentially immediately after the opening of the new bridge.
When did the new bridge open?
In October of last year.
And so demolition formally began after that?
It technically began a little bit before on certain areas of the bridge that weren't impacted by the maintenance of traffic. However, the full demolition where the deck began coming off and piers and et cetera started coming down.
So you were in a real hurry to get that old bridge demolished. And you started before the new bridge was in operation?
There was
technically?
We started before following the contractor submitted schedule, and that was as a result of actually some really severe condition issues in the fenders of the main channel span area. Actually, one of them fell off. And so that required us to do some selective demolition.
Well, congratulations on the new facility. I haven't been down to the new one yet, but I saw it being built about a year ago, so it's very exciting. Any other questions for the agency? Okay, well, thank you. We do have one public... Sorry, Mr. Secretary, were you trying to say something?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay, great. We do have one public witness, John Corn from Bike, Maryland. Can you join us? And once again, Mr. Corn, you have 2 minutes.
One more time for me. Four out of four. Chair Corman, Vice Chair Watson, members of the subcommittee, John Corn, bicycle advocates for Annapolis and Anne Arundel County, representing a broad coalition of advocates from across the state of Maryland. Why I'm here on MDTA, we certainly aren't looking for bike lanes on toll roads, but in our endeavor to create a safe, interconnected network of safe places to walk and bike, oftentimes the impediment is either a body of water or an interstate highway. And so we think MDTA has a narrow but really vital role in building out this network. So for example, bodies of water. Nationally, most every new bridge that's been built, major bridge across the country, has included a safe, separated bike pedestrian facility, which often can also be used by emergency vehicles. The Mario Cuomo replacement bridge for the Tappan Zee on the Hudson River, 4 miles separated bike ped facility. Pensacola Bay Bridge, same 3-mile bridge, less dense area, same thing, safe separated facility. It was a disappointment for the replacement Nice Bridge to first be announced by the governor to include such a facility, but in the end, that was taken away. So going forward, we have once in 50-plus year opportunities to provide safe facilities. So the American Legion Bridge, any new Chesapeake Bay crossing, any new Susquehanna River crossing should include, by policy, a safe, separated bike ped facility. So we would like to see MDTA adopt a policy in this regard. Interstates, often it's a safe crossing for people on foot or on bike. And so as new interstates are built, we would like MDTA to consider providing safe crossings. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I do have one question. You mentioned the governor Which governor was that?
Governor Hogan, when a press release at first announced the replacement for the Nice Bridge, the press release said it would include a separated bike pedestrian lane. But in the end, as the procurement came out and the ultimate decision was made, it was excluded from the bridge that was built.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. We hear the governor. We got to make sure we know who
Yes,
we're
I'm
talking
sorry.
about, so, great.
Yes.
Well, any other questions for this witness? Great. Well, thank you
Thanks
for
so
being
much.
here, and thanks to everyone else and all my colleagues. That not only concludes this budget hearing, but our budget hearings for this legislative session. So thank you all so much.